Good morning, church family. I'd like to welcome everyone to the Sunday morning Bible class at the Broad Street Church of Christ. For the last 5.5 months now, we've been seeking to answer the question, does archaeology support the Bible? Before I get started, I've been asked to put out a reminder or a request that there's quite a few men that are out this morning, so we need help with the worship service. So if we can get a few volunteers to meet back in the chapel after this class, that'd be greatly appreciated. Last week we left off in Genesis chapter, my notes are wrong, chapter 45, verse 10, and the region of Goshen. We discussed the biblical history and the archaeological findings of the biblical city of Zoan, also called Tanis by the Greeks. We found that the archaeology supports the Bible's descriptions of Zoan. We then introduced the city of Avaris, later named Ramses. We also started to talk about the Hyksos ruling period in Egypt. We had just started to talk about the historical mentions of Avaris and the Hyksos ruling period that are outside of the Bible when we ran out of time, and that's where we'll pick up today. This is the same map I showed you last week. I start with it today just to remind us of the geography of the area that we're going to be talking about today. Verse 10 talks about the region of Goshen, and the region of Goshen is this area here. Actually, it's labeled right there, Goshen. This is the southern border, this is the eastern border, and these two branches of the Nile are the western border. The city of Zoan, or Tanis as the Greek called it, is right there. During biblical times, particularly during the 20th and the 21st dynasties of Egypt, this was a port city. We know that by the way it's built, by what's there. This landmass is built up over the 3,000 years since that time, right here. The city of Avaris and Ramses is right here. It was first built as Avaris and then later renamed as Ramses. The city of Pithom is right here. Ramses and Pithom are the two store cities that the Bible, Exodus, tells us that the Israelis built while they were slave labor. And this map shows Sukkoth as a point, but this region here is Sukkoth, and we'll talk about that next week. Any questions about the geography before I move on? Okay. And this is where we left off last week. This is a slide of the historical mentions of Avaris and the Hyksos outside of the Bible. The Egyptica was a history of ancient Egypt written in Greek by the Egyptian historian Manetho. Manetho was a high priest of Amun-Ra at Heliopolis, which is also in the biblical region of Goshen. In writing the Egyptica, Manetho attempted to mediate both Egyptian and Greek cultures at the beginning of the Hellenistic period. The Egyptica was a comprehensive history of ancient Egypt, and it continues to be a vital resource in defining Egyptian chronology. Manetho organized the ruling pharaohs into 31 dynasties, and one of the questions last week was, what was a dynasty? It was a family, a ruling period. And his system continues to serve as the foundation for modern Egyptian chronology. The complete text of Egyptica has not survived. Fragments of the text do remain to this day. Fortunately, his works were quoted by several later authors, whose works still remain. These authors include the Jewish historian Josephus and the Christian historians Africanus, Eusebius, and Cincillus. In volume 2 of his work, it was a 3-volume work, in volume 2, concerning dynasties 15 through 17, Manetho writes of the Hyksos, Avaris, and the Israelis. He writes about the overthrow of the Hyksos at the start of Dynasty 18. It should be noted that Manetho was no fan of the Israelites, and he is often cited as the father of anti-Semitism. It also should be noted that Manetho was not the first person to mention the term Hyksos. This picture is a replica of a painting found in a tomb of Khnumhotep II, a governor of the 16 nome of Upper Egypt, which is in Goshen, during the reigns of pharaohs Amenemhat II and Senusret II of the 12th dynasty. It depicts a train of Semitic men, women, and children wearing an unusual, bright, multicolored garments. They are distinguished from the Egyptians by their skin color, their mushroom-shaped hair, their beards, and their clothing. They're also distinguished from the Egyptians by the items that they are carrying. For example, one of them is carrying a harp. The uniqueness of the scene is likely a reference to a specific migration event. The bulk of scholarly opinion is that these people are migrating into Egypt from Canaan. The inscription that goes with the painting identifies the leader as Abisha the Hyksos. It also says that he came with an entourage of 37 people. While the timing of the excuse me. While the timing of the migration does not match Jacob, it matches perfectly with Jacob's grandfather, Abraham, and his trip to Egypt, which is described in Genesis chapter 12. Many biblical scholars believe that Abisha is Abraham. Before I leave the historical mentions, I want to mention 7 quotes from Manetho from his Egyptica. This is from volume 2. Quote number 1. This whole nation was styled Hyksos, that is, shepherd kings. Quote 2. These people whom we have before named kings and called shepherds also, and their descendants, kept possession of Egypt. Now, Manetho describes the Hyksos as a shepherding population. I want to compare quotes 1 and 2 to Genesis chapter 47, verse 3. Pharaoh asked the brothers, "What is your occupation?" "Your servants are shepherds," they replied to Pharaoh, "just as our fathers were." I also want to compare it with verses 5 and 11. Verse 5. Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Settle your father and your brothers in the best part of the land. Let them live in Goshen." Verse 11. So Joseph settled his father and his brothers in Egypt and gave them property in the best part of the land, the district of Ramses, as Pharaoh directed. Quote number 3. Avaris was the ancient city and country of the shepherds, given to them within Egypt. The underline was me, not the original text. In quote 3, Manetho states that Avaris was given to the Hyksos. Compare this with Genesis chapter 47, verses 5 and 11, which I just read. Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Settle your father and your brothers in the best part of the land. Let them live in Goshen." So Joseph settled his father and his brothers in Egypt and gave them property in the best part of the land, the district of Ramses, as Pharaoh directed. So Manetho says that the land was given to them. The Bible says that the land was given to them. Quote 4. At length, the Hyksos made one of themselves king, whose name was Selitus. In quote 4, Manetho states that the name of the first Hyksos ruler was Selitus. This name is interesting. Manetho wrote Egyptica in the Greek language. In this language, the suffix is is added at the end to denote male. So if you remove the suffix, that leaves us with Salit. Genesis chapter 42, verse 6 states that Joseph was the governor of the land. The word that is translated to governor in this verse is Salit. So perhaps Salit was a title rather than a name to refer to Joseph. Quote 5. The kings of Thebes and other parts of Egypt made an insurrection against the shepherds. In quote 5, Manetho states that the Hyksos were overthrown. Exodus chapter 1, verse 8 says, "Then a new king to whom Joseph meant nothing came to power in Egypt." Quote 6. That this nation, thus called shepherds, were also called captives in their sacred books. In quote 6, Manetho says that the shepherds called themselves captives in their sacred books. Exodus chapter 1, verse 11 states that the Egyptians, quote, put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. The word slaves is used 70 times in the Old Testament to refer to the Israelites. Quote 7. Eventually, the Hyksos took their journey from Egypt through the wilderness, and they built a city in that country which is called Judea, and that large enough to contain this great number of men, and called it Jerusalem. In quote 7, Manetho is clearly linking the Hyksos people with the Israelites. I need to note that it is not popular in academia to outright identify the Hyksos as Israelites. To do so would invalidate many decades of statements like Exodus of the Bible is a myth. Some scholars will use the term Canaanites for the Hyksos based on their point of origin before arriving in Egypt. And those who are a little bolder may use the term Proto-Israelites. As for me, I don't know whether the Israelites are the Hyksos, but it's very clear to me that the time frame that the Israelites were in Egypt overlaps with the time frame of the Hyksos rule in Egypt. Any questions about Manetho before I move on? Okay. This slide, when I'm finished, will be an archaeological list of archaeological studies conducted at Tel El Daba, which is the archaeological site of Avaris. In 1885, the Swiss archaeologist Henry Edward Naville conducted the first excavation at Tel El Daba. Between 1941 and 42, Egyptian archaeologist Labid Habachi conducted 2 seasons of excavations at Tel El Daba and concluded that it was the site of an ancient city of Avaris and the capital of the Hyksos era. This conflicted with earlier pronouncements of Pierre Montet, who had claimed that Avaris was at Tel Sanhel Hagar, which is now known to be Zone or Tanis. Habachi's claim that Tel El Daba was Avaris was not widely accepted until the late 1960s. Between 1951 and 54, Egyptian archaeologist Shahata Adam conducted seasonal excavations and discovered a 12th dynasty temple for the worship of Pharaoh Amenemhet I, who ruled between 1995 and 1965 BC. Between 1966 and 2009, with a brief interruption from 1970 to 74, Austrian archaeologist Manfred Bietak conducted yearly excavations at both Tel El Dabaa and Qantir. Qantir is the archaeological site for Ramses. His work convinced most archaeologists that Tel El Dabaa was indeed Avaris and that Qantir was Ramses. And quite frankly, we owe a lot to Bietak because he's the one that brought biblical archaeology in Egypt together. Since 2009, excavations at both sites have been under the leadership of the Austrian archaeologist Irene Forster Muller. This is a photograph of Tel El Dabaa taken in 1979 by one of the staff members of Manfred Bietak. So that's a good question. These things that you see here are dirt that's a walkway, so that they don't trample all over the ruins as they're digging it up. They're digging it up, and you can see here some of those ruins here that this guy's working on. You can see some of the ruins here. You can see some of them inside. So the raised areas are the original level of the soil, and they're using those as walkways so they don't have to walk on the.
And there may be something under here, but
they've chosen not to at that in 1979 at that particular point. Later, they will probably dig it up. Sometimes archaeologists, after they uncover something and they know they're going to leave the site for a while, will actually bury it back to protect it. Any other questions? Okay. Let's go over the archaeological findings at Tel El Dabaa. Normally at this point, I make a comparison of the biblical history of Avaris and compare it to the archaeological findings at Tel El Dabaa. However, the city of Avaris by this name is not mentioned in the Old Testament at all, making a comparison of the two impossible. So I will provide the archaeological findings at Tel El Dabaa and link it to potential biblical history as applicable. The earliest settlement found at Avaris is a memorial temple for the pharaoh Amenemhet I, which was built in the 5th year of the reign of Senusret III, which is about 1867 BC. This would have been during Abraham's lifetime. The population at this time was clearly Egyptian, and the temple was abandoned at least by 1750 BC or during Joseph's lifetime. After the memorial temple was abandoned by the Egyptian population, a group of Syro-Canaanites settled at Avaris, significantly enlarging the settlement. Now remember, academia will not call these people Israelites. They call them Syro-Canaanites based on the pottery and the weapons and stuff that they find coming from Canaan. We know that the Israelites came from Canaan. The Syrio is interesting. When I first read this, where did Abraham come from? He came from Haran. Where is Haran? In northern Syria. Where did Isaac get his wife from? He got his wife from Haran, which is in Syria. Where did Jacob get his 2 wives from? Haran, which is in Syria. So it's not unexpected to see some Syrian culture there as well as Canaanites as they came through. According to archaeologist Manfred Bietak, these Canaanite settlers were not invaders, but immigrants who settled peacefully. These Canaanites were initially shepherds with large herds of goats and sheep. However, based on the objects found in the tombs from this time period, these foreigners were employed by Pharaoh as soldiers, sailors, shipbuilders, and craftsmen. During this time frame, a temple to the Canaanite storm god Baal Zephon was constructed at Avaris. Baal Zephon is seen by this group as being equivalent to the Egyptian storm god Seth. Cylinder seals with Baal inscriptions were found at this temple. And this is it's a drawing of one of the cylinder seals depicting a northern Syrian Canaanite storm god of Baal Zephon. This god was identified with the Egyptian weather god of Seth. During the 14th dynasty, in the years just before Jacob and his family arrived in Goshen, this god became known as the Lord of Avaris. Interestingly, Baal Zephon is mentioned in Exodus chapter 14, verse 2, as a critical landmark where the Israelis were told to encamp just before crossing the sea on dry land. Presumably, a temple of Baal may have existed there. That means that God demonstrated his ability to control the winds and the sea in front of the Canaanite storm god of Baal Zephon. Any questions about that seal? Me? No, I'm sure that the archaeologists that dug this up could tell you exactly what each of those symbols mean, but I don't know what those symbols mean other than what I read in the text. It's clearly a Canaanite god of Baal. It's clear that they equated it with Seth, the Egyptian storm god, and this was found at Avaris. That's about all I know about this.
Do we know how the Canaanite people came to be called Canaanites?
From
Their land was called Canaan.
Canaan was one of, I think it was a grandson of Noah, and so the area where he settled was called Canaan. And in the list of nations in Genesis chapter 12, I believe it is, it describes the land of Canaan. It actually talks about the borders of the land of Canaan, where the ancestors of Canaan settled. Any other questions? Okay. Most historians believe that the Hyksos period of rule in Egypt began about 1650 BC. Compare this to the Bible's timeline that suggests that Jacob and his family arrived at Goshen in 1661 BC. Beginning about 1650 BC, the settlement at Avaris expanded greatly to about 620 acres. Based on extrapolation from dwelling counts and standard household size, archaeologist Manfred Bietek estimates that the population at Avaris grew to about 1 million people by the end of this period. The architecture of the houses changed during this time period to a design that's similar to what archaeologists call the Israeli four-room design. On the left is a model, and on the right is a diagram of what archaeologists call the Israeli four-room house. This style house has routinely been found in archaeological sites all over Israel, starting from about the 14th century BC, which is after the conquest period, and lasting through the 6th century BC, or at about the time of the Babylonian captivity. Interestingly, this style house is also similar to houses found in northern Syria in the 19th century, when Abraham and his father Terah lived in Haran, and to the houses found in Avaris in the 17th and the 16th centuries, when Jacob lived in Egypt. Any questions about the Israeli four-room houses? Near the end of the Hyksos period, at the western edge of Avaris, along the eastern bank of the Pelusaic branch of the Nile River, a citadel was constructed on previously uninhabited land. This palace was in the Egyptian style, but whoever lived there was some kind of, whoever lived there was some kind of high official, but he was not Egyptian. He was West Semitic or Canaanite. Such an honor to a foreigner was extraordinary in Egypt. Some archaeologists believe that this is Joseph's citadel. This is a reconstruction of the palace of an Egyptian high official, but of foreign Canaan descent. This is the citadel. This is the living quarters of the high Egyptian official, and these are 2 bedrooms. How many sons did Joseph have? These are 2 spare bedrooms here. This is a portico, like you see in Rome. Interestingly, that right there, and we're going to see another picture of it here, is a pyramid-shaped tomb, which this official was eventually buried in. And along here and here are 11 tombs. How many sons, how many brothers did Joseph have? This is another picture of that reconstruction. This is the Egyptian pyramid-shaped tomb. Now, keep in mind, only pharaohs and their queens are buried in a pyramid-shaped tomb. So to bury a foreigner in this kind of a tomb is an incredibly high honor. And along here are Canaanite-style tombs, here, here, and over here. 11 of them. Any question there? Inside this tomb, in this outer chamber right here, is the next slide. This picture shown here is a reconstruction of a statue of a seated figure twice normal human size. The figure had pale yellow skin with a mushroom-shaped hair and a multicolored coat, clearly not Egyptian. These are features that Egyptians typically used to portray people from Canaan. The statue had a throw stick over its right shoulder, a symbol of authority. There was evidence that the tomb had been robbed. There was no body inside, which is unusual. Tomb robbers usually take the valuables, but they rarely steal the body. However, Genesis chapter 50, verse 25 records that Joseph asked the Israelites to carry my bones up from this place when they leave Egypt for the promised land. Exodus 13:9 records that Moses took Joseph's bones with him when he left Egypt. Joshua 24:32 records that Joseph's bones were buried at Shechem in Canaan. And you may recall that when we talked about the city of Shechem, we talked about the tomb of Joseph. The statue had been deliberately destroyed. Archaeologists note that such acts are rare because they require both time and effort. The destruction appears to be clearly personal. Any questions about this statue? The overthrow of the Hyksos dynasty occurred about 1550 BC. At about this same time, the settlement of Avaris changed. Joseph's citadel, or the Canaanite citadel, if you will, was destroyed, and enormous storage facilities were set up, including grain silos. A new military compound was established with 3 buildings surrounded by a mud brick wall. The building appeared to reuse the bricks from the Hyksos citadel. Metal workshops were found that appeared to produce arrowheads. These arrowheads were from southern Egyptian design. Southern Egyptian pottery were also found at this level. This suggests a military occupation of a South Egyptian origin. By the way, when the Hyksos were, history records that when the Hyksos were overthrown it was overthrown by a southern pharaoh, a southern Egyptian pharaoh. Coincidentally, this corresponds nicely with chapter 1 of the book of Exodus. Verse 8 says, "Then a new king to whom Joseph met Nunthan came to power in Egypt. This new king could have been the overthrower of the Hyksos dynasty." Verse 11 states, "So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh." Archaeology tells us that enormous storage facilities, including silos, were built during this time frame at Avaris. At approximately 1450 BC, and by the way, coincidentally, that's when the Bible says the Exodus occurs, the Semitic population suddenly abandoned Avaris. Archaeologists found mass graves with multiple bodies in shallow pits, indicating a catastrophic event or plague. The bodies ranged in age from infant to senior adult. This is around the same time frame that the Bible suggests the Exodus begins. So to summarize, while the Bible is silent about Avaris, archaeology supports the theory that Jacob and his descendants were at Avaris during their sojourn in Egypt. Any questions? Okay, now I'm going to switch over to the city of Ramses, which is partially built on top of Avaris. The first bullet on this slide is where I left off with the archaeological findings at Tel El Dabah, or Avaris. I've included it here for comparison purposes. Around 1290 BC, or 150 or more years after the Semitics abandoned Avaris, Pharaoh Seti I began construction of a summer palace at Qantir near the abandoned city of Avaris. It is likely that he died before the completion of the palace, and the palace was completed by his son, Ramses II. This summer palace was about 100 feet from the riverbank. It was constructed on a 230 by 150 foot platform. A ramp on the east side gave access to the palace. There were watchtowers overlooking the river. When Seti I died, his son Ramses II became pharaoh, and he completed the construction that his father started at Qantir. He renamed the city Per-Ramses, which means the house of Ramses. In addition to the completion of the summer palace, he built another palace about 255 feet southwest of the summer palace. There was an open courtyard between the two palaces. The second palace was much larger than the earlier summer palace and consisted of about 3 acres. A temple for Amun-Ra was also built at Qantir. A military stable complex was built that would suit 460 horses. Nearby was a workshop for making military weapons. After completion of the palace complex, Ramses II moved the capital from Thebes to Per-Ramses. After Ramses II's death, his son Merenptah moved the capital city back to Memphis. The city was slowly abandoned. About 1060 BC, the monuments that Ramses II established at Per-Ramses were moved to a new capital city at Tanis. So to summarize, the city of Ramses was built about 150 years or more after the Israelites left Egypt. It was occupied for less than a 100-year period. Are there any questions about Ramses? I have in my notes here that this would be a good place to stop with less than 10 minutes, and we got about 5 minutes to go. So this would be a great time for questions. While I'm waiting for questions, I'll kind of summarize here. For decades, maybe for a century, Egyptologists made the argument that the Exodus, if there was such a thing, had to have happened in the 13th century because Exodus chapter 1 mentions the city of Ramses. The city of Ramses, as we just talked about here, only existed during the 13th century BC. So because of this mention, the Exodus had to have occurred in the 13th century BC. And these same archaeologists, Egyptologists, then argue there's absolutely no evidence whatsoever that an Israeli or Canaanite population lived in Egypt during the 13th century, and there's absolutely no evidence whatsoever that there was a conquest in Israel that occurred during the 13th century. So therefore, these same archaeologists argue that although it had to have happened during the 13th century, the whole thing was a myth and a legend and never happened. The Bible, if you look at the Bible's timeline, tells us that the Exodus didn't happen during the 13th century, it happened during the 15th century BC. As I've laid out for you today, there's plenty of evidence that there was a Israelite, or let's call it Canaanite, population living in Egypt during that time frame. And oh, by the way, they left that region at exactly the same time the Bible says they left it. Oh, by the way, there's plenty of evidence, which we've talked about all during the last 5.5 months, of a conquest that occurred in Canaan during the 15th century BC. So if you are an Egyptologist that believes that the Exodus occurred in the 13th century, then there's absolutely no archaeological evidence whatsoever to support the Bible. But if you believe the Bible, when it says that the Exodus occurred in the 15th century, I've just showed you that there's plenty of evidence to suggest that the cities that existed at the time of the Bible are there, that the conquest of Canaan happened just exactly the way the Bible said it happened, and that the Exodus happened exactly the way that the Bible said it happened. Now, I should have raised some questions there. No? All right, next week we will talk about the cities of Pithom, which is one of the store cities, and we'll talk about the district of Sukkot. And that will be the end of archaeology and Genesis. And starting in January, Buddy will take over the class here on Sunday. Thank you.